Hey, thank you for joining our webcast today. I'm David Hattabus, President and CEO of CCNG, and today we're talking about employee attrition. And based upon the numbers of the people that signed up for this webinar, I'm guessing it's a bigger problem than we know. Our member and partner today is Ron Davis. He's the CEO of Tenacity, and we asked him to join us today to share insights regarding a recent survey conducted by CCNG and Tenacity, where we asked our members and industry colleagues how they measure the cost of attrition. And so Ron's going to present these findings today and discuss how to properly measure attrition costs and what steps should be taken to help prepare you, your organizations, to address this big problem. We planned about 45, 50 minutes. We can take the full 60 based upon Q&A. And we'll start by setting the stage with Ron's thoughts and insights around the survey results, and then we'll get into your questions through the end of the webcast. During any time during the webcast today, please use that question box on your screen to submit your questions for Ron. Any questions that we do not have time to address during the webcast will carry over into the online discussion group we've set up for the participants in this webcast. I'll have more to talk about that later in the webcast today. We also have a poll question for you. It's not a tough question. It's kind of a yes or no type question. So I expect nearly all of you to participate. And the question will, results of the poll question will be shared during our Q&A session. So that's our setup. Ron, welcome. Thank you very much for taking time with us today. Let me turn it over to you to get things going.
Gosh, thanks, David. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you all coming here today. David did promise thoughts and insights from me. I don't promise any insights, but I will give you my thoughts. And hopefully you'll find some of them insightful. The first thing I want to do is thank you. So many of you participated in this research, and we think it's really important research. We've seen and heard from so many of you and had so many conversations. It's the opportunity that was presented to us through David to survey this membership. It's just an excellent one because we, as a company, really believe in rigorous measurement, and we thought it was a great opportunity to take what we think are the insights we're gleaning from our conversations and take maybe a more grown-up, rigorous measurement kind of view of things. So thank you so much for that. And also for all the individual conversations we've had with you and the online discussion and at the regional meeting, such great questions and feedback and discussion there. I think really enriching our understanding. So thank you so much for that. So I want to talk a little bit today about why we commissioned this survey. So, many of you know that the cost of attrition is high, right? And in fact, often surveys will show that senior leaders in call centers will say, oh, this is our biggest problem, or it's our second biggest problem. Rarely do we see it land below third biggest problem. And it's been that big of a problem for, 20-some years. So we came into this market, we assumed everybody knew what it costed. And so we started asking companies, what's your attrition cost? How do you measure it? And I used the snowflake to go with a certain metaphor, which is our experience was that everyone had a different answer. And not just that everyone's attrition costs were different, but everyone measured it very differently. What they considered a hard cost, what they considered a soft cost, what they just included one way or another, how they did the math, did they consider productivity, all this stuff. So we felt really, I would say, overwhelmed at trying to figure out how to pull that apart. And over time, we started to develop what we thought were some best practices. But then once we got a chance to survey you, we basically got to say, hey, how do you measure this? We're able to be systematic about it. Who includes what and why? So we've layered together multiple conference discussions with this rigorous survey data and, of course, some online discussion to put together our presentation for you today. And it turns out my initial question was, does everybody measure this in their own sweet snowflakey way? Turns out to be fairly resounding yes. Then I say that with maybe a tad bit of cynicism, but just to say we did receive confirmation that you all do this very differently, And which is, okay, it's sort of one thing to say, all right, you do it differently, but it's quite another. We also discovered that you all like to learn from each other how to do it better. And so we tried to, basically, we're going to share what we saw, and then we're going to share some best practices that we've gleaned from that. So I hope that's helpful. And let's go and look at what some of the learning was that came with this yes for the snowflake question. So the first thing to know is I want to give you an example before we go too deep into this infographic. We often talk, my company helps companies with attrition, and we often talk to potential clients. And to give you an example, not long ago we spoke to a bank. And this bank, we spoke to two banks actually, and they were competitors. They had call centers, contact centers that were answering the same kind of calls. They had centers in the same town. They had the same length of training. They had roughly the same productivity ramp, and they had roughly the same pay. And one of them told us their cost was $3,500 per trip, and the other told us it's just over $10,000. And that for us really drove home the importance of sort of understanding who is considering what and how can we basically get those two in a room and enrich each other, right? Usually you don't say, hey, let's go talk to your competitor. People don't get excited about that, but we figured CCNG was the perfect place to bring people together to discuss this. So let's take these one by one for a second. So sourcing and HR processing, right? How do you get people in the door? Right? It's the first question we ask. And how much does that cost you? Are you measuring this? So if you look over here on the left, you can see some of the line items that show up under sourcing and HR processing, right? There's sort of the easy, like, time spent, right? That it costs your HR department or whoever's in charge of it time to do background checks, to add people to payroll, to get security clearance, all that kind of stuff, right? Not a lot of time, but it adds up. Interviewers, we noticed still a pretty significant percentage of you included that in your HR processing measurements. So, of course, this is a variable cost to a point, right? Your company, depending on the size of your company, needs more interviewers if you have more attrition, right? So when you're looking at your cost per trip, we still found, well over half of you were including this as a line item. Same with advertising, right? So, and this can come through third parties. I guess we'll get to that in just a second. We see very similar measurements there between advertising and third parties. But are you putting stuff on, job boards? Are you putting stuff in newspapers? Where are you getting your people? Because the more people that quit, the more you got to spend on this sort of thing, Monster.com, etc. Now, it's interesting to me that over 60% of you, over 60% of you included recruiters and staffing agencies. So this, to me, suggests that a lot of you use recruiters and staffing agencies. So it wasn't actually even a question we meant to answer, but this gives you maybe a sense of probably roughly what percentage of you are using third party to bring people in the door. And of course, you see here in the parentheses, we see a lot of versions of how these pay arrangements are structured, right? Is it a fee per agent who's hired, or a fee per agent who's hired who makes it, 12 weeks in? We see sometimes a staffing agency is paid a percentage of pay. There's a lot of arrangements. So, but it looks to us that many of you are trying to include that in your measurement. So that's good. Referral fees from employees. This one is, I'm pleased to see that you have this high of a number, because it also suggests that at least half of you are offering referral fees. And we often see that employees who are referred into an organization are much more likely to stay. Probably because a fit has been assessed, probably because they have some sort of enthusiastic friend that works at your company, right? So this is good. This is good. One thing to note about referral fees from employees that we see is there's some confusion around how to sort of cost this out per attrit. So instead of saying, okay, well, it's a $100 referral and then it's $500 if they make it so much money, it's confusing. So the easiest thing you can do is just add up the total number of referrals that are paid out in a month, $5,000, and we had, 500 a trip. So, okay, it's $10 per a trip, right? You can make it easier on yourself. Some people try to make the math on this too hard. And then, of course, there's bonuses for some staffing agencies or third parties, depending on, we see all kinds of versions of contracting, right? Depending on performance, depending on length of tenure, et cetera. So that's sourcing and HR processing, right? And most of you are including most of those line items, but when I say most, note that that's still 50 to 80-some%. So there's many of you who aren't including it, and it might be worth noting that so many of your peers are, and thinking about, again, when we look at the cost of attrition, we really try to look at the variable cost. There's certain infrastructure you have to have around. You're going to have an HR department. But if the HR department is spending a lot of its hours on this, you probably are staffed more heavily than you would be otherwise. It's like that. So keep that in mind. Now, training, I was not surprised, I will have to say, this 98% number up in the upper right-hand corner. When we talk to companies, if you say, what's the cost of attrition? Pretty much every company includes this line item. So this didn't surprise me. What's interesting is many companies often think the hourly wages of trainees, they think of it as the only line item. So watch out for that. But so you've all got that, and we're not going to spend any time on that. Trainer salary, though, is a variable cost usually. The number of lessons you have to hold particularly is affected, particularly if you're a larger organization, is variable. And it's good to see that many of you are including that. Do watch out, though. There's some sneaky costs there. You've got overhead for these trainers and the trainees, right? Payroll, taxes, and workman's comp, and benefits. If you're paying those, which presumably are, some of those legally you have to, they are part of the cost, right? It's just part of the cost of having those people around. So make sure you're not just paying attention to wages. And then, basically you see that both with the trainer and the trainee, right? You see this with the trainer's admin, taxes, et cetera. So I want to pause there and say, so those two categories, I'm going to show you a chart of how this roughly tends to break down in a little bit. So what are the costs? But I think right now I want to say it's important to me to sort of describe what we asked about, and for you to see that it looks like you guys are doing a really rigorous job around salaries. Both the trainer and the trainee, but maybe slipping up a bit on some of the overhead costs. So watch carefully for that. And props to you, those of you who are getting it. All right. Now, nesting. Nesting is this funny, ambiguous, transitional stage, right? And everybody has a different word for it. So I'm sorry if the word nesting is not what you use. When we write about this online, we sometimes call it the halfway house. And it's that funny stage where people are kind of half in class and half on the phone, and they've got extra mentoring, et cetera. So let's look at the line items for nesting. All right. So usually we see, of course, the salary of the agents. Right. People think about this. Right. Salary of agents is one of those really obvious costs. Some companies are also doing a portion of that, right? So they're looking at, all right, well, how much time do people spend on the phone, or how productive is that time, right? They might look at their average handle time, generate some sort of fractional view of productivity. But one way or another, they're looking at the salaries. Let's skip down to number 3 here, because 1 and 2, something I'm reading about this they seem redundant. I don't know how that happened. 3, again, don't forget that overhead, right? This is part of the cost of having people go through nesting, just like it's part of the cost of having them go through training. Part of the cost of having them on the phone, right? And it's great when they're on the phone full time, but there's still some waste here. People have to go through this expensive stage, and they're not very productive. So that's worth keeping an eye on. Now, what we find, and there's some variance here, but we find the trainer usually follows them from the classroom into the sort of nesting situation. And so it'd be interesting to hear from you, if that's consistent with your experience. We didn't specifically ask that in the survey, but we do find that that is typical. And then, of course, if you're looking at the trainer's salary, you need their overhead, any bonuses or benefits they've got. Something we see less frequently is technology license costs. So typically a company in this sort of extended training period, has developed their own materials, they own it. But sometimes they haven't, or, at this point you're paying per seat cost, say for your WFO system or your performance management system. If that's available to your nesting agents, and your nesting agents are only partially productive because they're new and they're in nesting, some percentage of that is being wasted. And we'll talk about how to measure that a little later, but keep in mind that is part of the cost of nesting. One of the other things that's so great about nesting, but is expensive, is that you bring in other agents, right? You bring them in as buddies and mentors, and that's a great way to up-train those buddies and mentors. And of course, they work with maybe 3 or 4 agents, coach them, but they're off the phone. And so all of a sudden their salaries and their overhead starts to become a cost. So I'm not suggesting that that's a bad idea, but it is a cost associated with moving people through nesting. So watch that, and of course, their overhead as well. So let's go to the next slide. Now, here is where things get really sticky. So it's how companies measure their productivity. So when I come back to this in a minute, I'm going to talk about some suggestions about how this should work based on us having dove deeper underneath this material. But let's just talk for a minute here about what you're doing right now. I was really pleased to see that 3/4 of you say your agents are fully productive by 3 months. Now, fully productive is a hard thing to define, so we tried to define that well in the question stem in the survey. And one of the things we asked was, we said, please make sure you're not talking about when you want your agents to be productive or when you expect them to be to goal, but literally look and see when they, on average, actually get there. So we did ask the question very specifically, and 3/4 of you say 3 months, they make it. So good job, and make sure you're always asking yourself the question that specifically, right? When do they actually get there on average, not when do we expect them to? There often is a gap. Now, about 1/3 of you have started measuring the cost of agent wages during the productivity ramp, and this is where I think the biggest gap is going to be. 1/3 of you are doing it, which is great, but trying to figure out how to allocate those wages, what percentage of them are waste and all that. That's what we're going to work on here in a second. But I applaud those of you who are doing that, because it's hard to do without having a model that everybody has shared. So thank you for being the pioneers and helping us develop that model, and we'll share some more of that here today. And I thought that this was an interesting KPI here. How many calls a day is an agent handling? If you really want to get simple about measuring the cost of wasted productivity in the ramp or in the nesting period, this is a helpful sort of, we'll call it a heuristic or shortcut, right? If a normal agent, a fully baked agent, answers 50 calls a day, and a nesting agent answers 30, they're 60% productive. 40% of their wage and overhead is sort of wasted, put air quotes around it, wasted because it's not being used toward productivity, and the reason for that is the attrition that happens. So anyway, I thought that was pretty cool, and 70% of you do keep an eye on that. In terms of the productivity metrics, you all can read, so I won't say too much here, just to say that the highest metrics we're seeing, or the most measured metrics we're seeing around this are speed related, number of calls and average handle time. So as much as the chatter is, everybody's paying more attention to CSAT and NPS now, at least this survey points in a slightly different direction. You all are still worried about efficiency. And I'm not telling you that's right or wrong. I'm just telling you that's what you told me. So keep an eye on that. I think both are affected, obviously, by agent attrition and tenure. And it's important to be tracking both. But this kind of gives you a sense of where organizations are prioritizing their resources. So Something I would say was a really big learning for us is that people are pretty self-aware about their sort of lack of knowledge of what their true attrition cost is. So, first we did not believe because we sell a solution, right, in the space. So people always said, oh, I know what the cost is. It's, $3,500 or $10,000 or whatever. And it's always, of course, a little awkward to say, I don't know what the cost is. It's my biggest problem. And so we just assumed there was kind of a blind spot in the industry, and we were wrong about that because in the safety of a place of their home office or wherever they are, answering a survey, people were, I suppose, more transparent or brutally honest, and they said to us, "Look, we don't know." A huge percentage said that they don't know what the cost is, or certainly don't know it with a lot of granularity. So we don't blame people for projecting confidence. That's what executives are paid to do. But I also appreciate the sort of intellectual honesty they're showing us and saying, hey, there's this gap. So one thing that we did also see, though, is that there is some insecurity about, hey, do my peers know? Because this is the biggest thing I feel like I should know. So I'm here to tell you most of your peers tell us they don't know either. So you are in good company. But we can help each other move forward together. So, we think really here, this means there's a thought leadership gap. And I think this opinion is shared by CCNG. I don't want to put words in David's mouth that he can tell us soon if he agrees. But I think this is very much, what we came to is, okay, so many of you say this is your biggest problem. So many of you show so much pain over this pain point. And you also tell us you don't really know how big the pain point is. You just know that it's kind of ouch, right? So we see that this is a chasm, right, that needs to be crossed, and it needs to be crossed with thought leadership. So to be just a tiny bit corny, and that's what I do because I'm a public speaker and we like to be corny. We're here to provide a little bridge. And so the thing about thought leadership is, for us to just come in and say, oh, we know this how it should be, we find that to be a little presumptuous. And I want you to know today that the model, some of the stuff that we're sharing with you, that we're going to be sharing with you, is pretty much 100% derived from insights we gleaned from you, whether from this survey or past discussions, whether from finance professionals all the way up to, CFOs of some of your biggest, multinational companies. We are always trying to build this organically from your insights. So when I say thought leadership, maybe it's more of a thought convening that we're doing, because these are not our thoughts originally, they are yours. So let's run back through that list of things I did and talk a little bit about how we see this typically playing out. So the example I'm giving you here today is a US-based call center, and we did some analysis with them. And it's actually a BPO, so their costs are, let's say, probably a tad leaner than most of you. But we happened to do this very recently after updating our model based on the insights we got from you, so we wanted to use that. And so let's go through the line items that we were just discussing and talk a little bit about how things showed up. So the first was sourcing and HR, right, which we talked about. How do you find your new employees? What does it cost to find them? There's a leakage problem here where new employees that maybe get interviewed but don't get hired, or get hired but don't show up to training. Sometimes there's a cost associated with getting them in the door, and sometimes that gets left out of the cost per trip. This is a very important concept to get, and I appreciate those of you who taught me this. If you vacate a seat, somebody leaves. Sometimes you have to hire 1.5 people to fill that seat. And sometime that other half a person, falls off halfway through training or something like that, right? You got to count the money you spent on that person to get them in the door and halfway through training. A lot of companies are making the mistake of only counting the cost of moving the person through training and into the seat, and they're leaving out all the people that don't quite make it through the funnel. That's part of your cost, and it's driven by the number of attrits you have, so watch out for that. The easy way to avoid that is add up the total sourcing and HR costs and divide by your number of attrits. Forget about how many are moving through the funnel, right? Just total cost divided by total number of attrits. Anytime you see the word leakage, that's going to be the way to do it. Now, training salary, 98% of you have that. So watch out for the overhead and the HR costs we talked about. But then also leakage here, right? People fail during training, or they quit, or you let them go, or whatever, right? But you paid a salary while they were there. So again, take your total training cost and divide it by the number of the trips. Forget about saying, okay, a person's in training for 120 hours and it costs X, Y, and it. Just look at the total training budget and divide by salary budget. Other marginal training costs include, I assume this is going to be, we talked about technology licenses. We talked about, sometimes you feed people. Of course, you've got, I think the trainer's salary is going to be our next item here. Oh, no, so this will also include the trainer's salary. Sometimes this is also included in trainee salary line. You can put it where you want for this particular company. Again, we're looking at other marginal training costs. And then for nesting, they did not look at productivity in nesting. So this particular company just said, what's the added cost of having, people off the floor supporting our agents in nesting, or keeping the trainer with the group, that kind of stuff. And it was expensive. It wasn't insane, but it was expensive. So far, most of you, like I said, most of you have got this training salary thing. Leakage, maybe less so. But the biggest line item tends to show up. But still, you're missing some. If you add all this together, it starts to really add up. Here's the real problem. Like I said, about 34% of you find different ways to measure the productivity cost. So some of you call this shrinkage. Some of you call it the productivity ramp. Some of you call it bulking up. I like bulking up. Just think it's sort of a funny meathead way to talk about it. You can call it what you want, but it works something like this, right? If you have, 100 agents, and it's a fully baked agent, who's finished that productivity ramp, can answer 10 calls a day, great. You need 100 agents. But if you've got a bunch of new agents who are in nesting or who are in their productivity ramp, and they can answer an average of 5 calls a day, you just have to have a bigger workforce, right, to answer the same bloody number of calls. So what's interesting is we've done a bunch of deep dives with companies, and there's a set of people who just say, well, that's a soft cost. And then there's another set who say, no, that's not a soft cost. It's just a harder to measure cost. It's actually a huge direct from the bottom line cost because it defines how large our workforce has to be. So this is a complicated concept, right? So I really appreciate, particularly the finance professionals who helped me sort of wrap my head around it. But basically, it's your workforce in most cases. If your attrition rate is somewhere between, say, 2 and 10% a month, which is kind of the range we typically see, BPOs sometimes are higher, your workforce is probably between 5 and 15% larger than it needs to be to answer the same number of calls if you had optimal attrition. And so you're talking about, 5%, 10% of your total cost is just there because you got a bunch of newbies answering fewer calls. So watch out for this. We have a guide, and we'll talk about this a little more in a minute, that actually helps you do the math. So you don't need a degree with a bunch of, background in calculus and statistical modeling. It's actually arithmetic, right? How many calls a day do you need to answer? How many people on average, how many calls a day does a fully baked agent average? How many does a person in week 1, week 2, week 3 average? It's just a bunch of arithmetic, right? But it's hard work to have built the model, and I credit those of you who taught us how. So we will share that at the end of this, but it's too complicated to do just in a webinar, and you probably want a finance person sitting next to you while you do it. I sure needed it as I learned it. But this is not a soft cost. This is directly coming out of your bottom line every day. Soft costs, I would say, include stuff that maybe a different way to say it is non-operational costs, which are still huge to your business, but they don't hit your bottom line, right? They hit someone else's. So your effect on customer acquisition costs, for instance, your effect on lifetime value, or customer retention, that stuff is a huge driver of business success, and it's measurable, but it does land outside the call center. And so what I've tried to focus on here is just the operational cost. Now, for those of you who are with BPOs, I will add this bulking up, or if you manage BPOs, right? If you're a vendor manager, this bulking up whether it affects you, who it affects depends on the structure of your contract, right? If you just pay per number of agents, then you pay the vendor that, and the effect is really on the company that's paying the vendor. If you adjust that by cost per call on the bonus side, well, that pushes the cost back onto the BPO. So there's some nuance to this, but that cost is going to fall on one side of the ledger or both in some form, and it will depend on your contract structure. But we have some words about that in our guide to help you figure that out. So that's kind of intense on the content side. I appreciate you tracking with me. I see that I think we've only had the number of people go down by 1 in this whole time. We've peaked 97. We're at 96 now. So I'm so glad that I didn't bore you to death. So this was a BPO, low-cost North American BPO to pay their people about, I think, starting wage for about $10.50 an hour with, I want to say, a 3 or 4 month productivity ramp at 2 weeks of training and 1 week of nesting. And you're still talking about almost $7,400 per trip. So some of you, captains, which is most of you, paying a lot more, maybe thinking more about the effect on the marketing side of the business, but even if leaving that out, just your pure operational costs are going to tend to run closer to $9,000 to $11,000. Totally depends. Again, if you're in a position where you train people for 4 days and they're productive in a week and a half, it's a different story. It's $3,000 in a trip, but that's the exception, not the rule. So this is worth noting because when you talk about this kind of magnitude, you're talking about, if you've got I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. If you've got 1,000 agents and you're losing, I say you have 2,000 agents. We'll keep the math simple for my poor brain. I have a cold today. I apologize if I sound nasally. I have a nasally voice anyway, but you add in the swollen sinuses and then throw in a sort of compensatory caffeine and Sudafed, and I don't really know where I am. So, but let's say you take this $7,400 in the trip, you have 2,000 people, and you have 5% monthly attrition rate. All of a sudden, you've got 100 times this number, 7,400. So you're talking about $740,000 in costs a month. Well, we see some companies are, throwing stuff like Taco Tuesdays at this as a solution. Well, Taco Tuesdays is not a solution to a $740,000 a month problem. So this is why we think this is important, because so many of you told us it's important, and we look at the magnitude of this problem, and it's eye-watering. So now we get to this next one. So there are, I think, a few reasons we're going to continue to do work in this area, and that we've built this guide, right? So the first is, you guys are the experts. We want to help increase your domain knowledge by basically reducing friction between you, right? Let's just do brain transfers between you. Since you all don't have the time to constantly sit around and do mind meld, that's what we're here for. We're getting this information. We're gathering it. We're collating it. We're analyzing it. We're finding people smarter than us to analyze it, and then we're bringing it back to you. So we're doing this to help you to basically, because we believe that customer service, customer experience, that these are some of the most important and overlooked areas of businesses, because we're touching millions of people a day, and the way we treat people affects how they treat people, and this is a huge impact we have on the world. And so we want to make sure that people who are in our industry can be their very best, and so we think helping each other is the best way to do that. The next thing is we really want to shape companies' ways of thinking about their spending decisions. So it's one thing to say, oh, yeah, attrition's my biggest problem, and have this sort of vague sense that it's expensive. But that's how you get this stuff like Taco Tuesdays, right, as answers to a vaguely expensive problem. Now, if you know it costs $740,000 a month, you can look at how much of that might be preventable, et cetera, and you can actually start to budget for what is an appropriate amount of resources to dedicate to this problem. And we think there's a huge problem with misallocation of resources, and we think getting clear on the cost is a huge step forward in that. So that's why we're putting so much energy into this. And then ultimately, for you to get that kind of money in place, the kind of capital allocated it takes to fix this problem, you've got to be able to build the case to the C-level. And, these people are demanding in terms of what they need to see, and so they need to see the size. They're going to need to see some other things, and we'll cover those maybe in another webinar, but one of the first things they need to know is how big is the problem and how much of this can we fix. And so that's why we put our energy into doing that today. We, as I said before, we sell attrition-related solutions, but for us, the motivation goes much deeper, than selling our own solutions, right? We think that what you are told us causes us to believe that there's a huge gap in investment in people, right? And you all want to invest in your people. You know it will make them better and stronger and do a better job for your customer. And your executives are treating you like a cost center. And so that's a tough treadmill you're on. We recognize that. So our job, we believe, is to empower you with the kind of information that will find its way into a Harvard Business School case, right? That will make any executive's heart go aflutter and make them want to give you the resources it takes to fix the problem. Because if they see how it really will drive their bottom line, that is the one thing that makes them very, very happy. So that's the end of sort of me presenting the results of this, and I want to turn it over to David.
Fantastic. Well done, and thanks for covering all that information concisely. We're going to take questions here in a minute, but let's start by getting to our poll question. Again, there's roughly 100 of you out there, as Ron mentioned. It's a simple question. You got 3 choices. It's not hard. We expect 100% participation. Simply, do you know what it costs your company every time someone leaves? You've heard the discussion that Ron has laid out. You know that your peers are not exactly on top of this, so it's okay to be honest. The poll question will be out there for another minute or so, and then we're going to share those results and Ron's interpretation of those results when we're all through polling here. So as we move into our Q&A here, Ron, I just want to start by saying, you and I, learned a lot from a recent discussion you led at the CCNG field event, which was hosted by ZipRecruiter. Thank you, ZipRecruiter, in Phoenix, Arizona.
Yes.
And there were many questions around how do you address these problems. There wasn't a lot of answers from the audience, but there was a whole lot of questions. Everything from how do you build a business case? How do you support the case? How do you test it? Why is it so damn important? What can be done about it? So I want to lead off with a question, which I think a lot of people don't address, and that is, you identify the problem as you pointed out, and now you need support. So give us an idea of who are the typical allies that people turn to when they're building a case regarding attrition to get support and ultimately investment to fix it.
Yes, that's a great question. So we see this happen in kind of 2 layers, I guess. Is the answer. The first layer is sort of the initial case building. So I'm assuming right now that you, the person listening, are kind of an operational leader, and you're like, hey, I want to do something about this. Usually the first person you lock arms with is either somebody, as high up as you can get without causing a problem in finance, and then probably or the person at the top of your WFM hierarchy, because those people have sort of mathematical chops to, if the model doesn't exist, to build it, or to work with, say, like to take a model like we've generated today and that we'll send out and adapt it. And so they're the ones who are going to help you just do the hard math and say, okay, yes, every time someone attrits, not only do we have to pay for their training, but this is how it affects our overall productivity, which therefore affects our headcount this way. Then they're going to be able to give you that sort of final number and defend it in a way that's going to make the people above pay attention. So that's the first layer of allies. So once you've done that, you start to just sort of say, like, look how big this problem is. I think the next layer of allies is, sometimes the benefit accrues outside the center. So if you are seeing an effect of something you do on CSAT scores or NPS scores or something along that line, you need an ally in marketing. You need that CX person in your organization to bring the CMO in. Basically, you need cross-departmental allies as you go up to the top, because if someone else is also going to get a benefit, it's pretty tricky for you to subsidize a rich department like marketing, right? You need them at the table with you. So start with your pointy-headed finance and WFM forecasting people, we'll call them, and then move into thinking about if there's a partner in another part of your organization that would like to see your call center be more effective, and then together you start to head up. Those are the initial sort of allies I would look to. David, if you're saying something, you must be muted.
I was just checking to see if you were listening. No, one of the questions in the question box here is, will the presentation slides be available, and will the recorded version be available? Yes, the recorded version will be emailed to all of you to share with your staff, and the slide content will come as a part of the online discussion group, so I'll make sure I mention that at the end. Let me get to the next question. There's some really good ones here. I'm not sure how to prioritize, but let me read this one to you. Should you look to alter your method of measuring attrition to match an industry metric or to sync up with an accepted internal philosophies? How do you see that?
Depends what you're trying to do. So usually you have to, I think industry metrics are going to be where the best practices come from. Usually local philosophies present challenges, we'll say, right? They're not taking a global view. That being said, ultimately I'm advocating for you being a change agent in your organization. And so you do have to think about the sort of gap between where your organization is and where you're taking it, and how far and fast you can take it. So what I would say is, the right way, the answer is it depends, but the right way to measure is probably to look to an industry standard, but that's only right as in if you're trying to be rigorous and understand what it really costs you. Now, there may be an intermediate step where you're trying to figure out, you're sort of acting as a translator to your company, and you're going to say, like, look, even though we know that the productivity ramp, bulking up I called it, is a hard cost, we know what the bottom line cost. There's, our operational leaders aren't quite ready to wrap their minds around this. Let's do this in steps or something like that. But no, I mean, the nice thing about this is there is sort of an objective truth here, right? Which is that a cost is a cost, and you could get, every industry has different ways that the costs show up. So there are some adaptations that need to be made. But in the end, you want to know, does somebody leaving cost us $1? And that is an answerable question. Not an easily answerable question, but an answerable question. So I think if the question is objectivity, look outside. I think if the question is organizational change, I'd say adapt a little bit to the inside.
Okay. This question's kind of around best practice standard. What's the right way to establish the appropriate target for our attrition? Is there a consensus best practice attrition rate? Great question.
I would say look to your industry. If you've seen the consultants in the industry give an answer to this. What you don't want to do is the average, because we've done a pretty lousy job of that historically. Look to the high performers in your industry that are still actually competitors. So if you're in finance, you'd be looking, or if you're credit cards, right? Amex is the gold standard. Look at those gold standards. The number that I see the most often from the thought leaders and consultants of the world is 2% a month. Although lower in healthcare. Healthcare is more like 1 to 1.5 is sort of the optimal rate. But yeah, it is going to be a little bit industry dependent. If you're outbound sales, for instance, it's going to be a little higher. Presumably you use their first few days on the floor as part of the filtering mechanism.
Next question is, do you add back a credit for not paying a salary while you're trying to fill a seat? Also, did you look at IT costs to set up a new laptop or system, creating system access, so on and so forth?
Great. So I'm going to take the second half of the question because I know the answer. So that we have that on other training costs. Essentially, like, what does it take to make a desk available? Whether that is rented software or sort of overhead IT. in the overhead category for labor that goes in? Great question. Adding back a credit for not paying a salary while you're trying to fill a seat. So if a seat is empty and you're not getting phone calls, it's not a credit unless you mean somehow that you're able to train people without paying them, and then you certainly wouldn't count that as a cost. So I may be misunderstanding the question. So if you want to write your question again, if I'm not getting to the answer, I do apologize. Also, David's going to give my contact information at the end. If you want to talk to me afterward, we can go into much deeper so I can understand exactly what you mean.
Sure. Thank you for saying that. We've learned a lot about attrition, and it's driven by many, many, many variables. So what we heard was if you want to fix it, how do you do that? How do you test it? Whether it's a technology like Tenacity or somebody else, or even just, some internal initiative, is there a way to do some kind of an A/B test to see if you're actually moving the needle?
So my answer was going to be do an A/B test. So I think we must be on the same wavelength. So this is interesting to me, but I hear this from call center executives all the time. Attrition is a multi-variable driven outcome. There's no way to know why it happens. And then I get a little bit belligerent about this because, since about 1885, we've known how to do that, and it's called a randomized control trial. You can A/B test your way to it. So we have some interesting guidelines on how to do that. But basically, the sort of short version is to find two similarly situated groups, right? Same center, same kinds of calls, same team, same tenure, same KPIs, and compare. Give one group try an intervention with one group and a control with another. And see. Okay, does the new CSAT improvement program or the new attrition improvement program work with Group A? Well, look at the gap between Group A and Group B. That's the effect of the intervention. Group B got all the same other changes that were going on, right? Labor market conditions, product change, all that. Everybody has both, right? So the gap between Group A and Group B can isolate a variable. And I would also say demand that from your client, right? When they say there's an ROI, say, baloney, prove it to me. You do an A/B test for me, and let's see if there really is an ROI or if you're just taking credit for stuff that happened.
Got it.
And do the same thing to yourself when you try initiatives, too. Yeah.
Ron, we've had a dozen people or so join since we asked the poll question, so I'll pop it back up there. The poll remains open. If you haven't voted, we appreciate you taking a vote. Ron will interpret all that when we get near the end of the questions, which we were probably 3-4 minutes from. So back to questions. Do you find that a workforce that works from home has a lower cost of attrition, and if so, why?
Yeah. Well, it depends on how you structure it. So there are certain work from home companies where people actually end up sort of paying for their own training. So absolutely in those cases. Some of your per seat costs are lower. So yes. We sometimes see higher attrition rates though. And then maybe offset by a higher rate. But in terms of cost per attrit, I would say typically it is a little bit lower, just because all costs are a little bit lower, basically.
And why is that?
Just because you're not paying for a building, you don't have to pay for the real estate to fill the seat. Technology costs tend to be a tad lower. It's a leaner model, so your general cost per agent is a little lower, so your cost per attrit ends up being a little lower.
Got it. This is a bit of a long one, so let me read through it. I would like to add to the industry standard that gets tossed around. Sometimes industry standard gets overridden by geography. In Dallas, for example, you have too many call centers in the geographic area. That ends up with professional students. Jumping from company to company will sometimes override that comparison of your particular industry.
I would say it's worth noting that your geo may affect this, right? Dallas is a super competitive market. However, we do often hear from companies that have very typical attrition rates that it's because of their competitive market. We find the rates the same in less competitive markets. We find that there are still people in those competitive markets who are paying the same pay rate that have low attrition. So be careful relying too much on it as a crutch, but I actually agree with that. It does affect you would want to be looking at people in your industry in similarly situated geos and looking at who are the best there and setting that as sort of a benchmark.
We may have answered this in part or in whole, but I'll just go through the question again. Attrition benchmarks are interesting anecdotally, but very hard to apply to your specific situation. What do you think is the most important to look at? Metrics and benchmarks from others in your community, your industry, your size, your function, sales or service, your BPO, or internal staff on-site or at home? Can you summarize that?
Yeah, I would say, look at, I would say industry, function, and BPO versus captive, if you have to pick. Those are the three that you are sort of like, what are other care centers in telecom that are internal? That's the sort of level of specificity. If there's something really weird about the geo, look at the geo. But as a general rule, when I say a geo, I'm limited to more like North America than Philippines or something like that. But occasionally there'll be some specific. Most of you are in a lot of competitive places because those places, that's why they're competitive, right? So that's going to be true for most of you anyway. I think those three things.
Okay, I'm going to stop the voting here, Ron, and because I really want you to take a minute on this one. So again, our poll question was, do you know what it costs your company every time someone leaves? And not sure that we had a good size sample, probably 35, 40% of you answered, so thank you very much. The results are 13% of you said, yep, I sure do. 44% of you said, nope, not a clue. And 41% of you said, well, I think so, maybe. So what is that? 85% of you are either no or not totally certain. What are you reading into that, Ron?
I think that's really lines up with I would say about 10% of companies do get really close to the right amount in terms of when we do. So part of our process when we work with companies is we actually do a sort of deep dive consultation and figure out what their cost per trade is within about a 5% variance anyway. And it's about 1 in 10 that have gotten really close. So I think this aligns nicely with reality. I think, not a clue for those of you. I say yay for your intellectual honesty and let's get that fixed. And for you, I think so maybe let's just be curious together and see if you can figure out if you do. And I will say something about the guide we're publishing. So it's kind of boring to read, but it's very useful. We have published a guide to measuring the cost of attrition in call centers for CFOs. As you can imagine, a more exciting document, and it will be shared, I think, on the site after. But it is very much a step-by-step, and okay, if you have this kind of variance or that kind of variance, it should be able to get 90% of you where you need to go. It'll be very useful. Although I would hand it to that WFM leader or financial person so they can take the first crack at it.
I want to get into one more question here, and if you can be brief with your answer, I don't want to run up against the clock. What contribution does agents' ability to balance their work life play in agents' hiring, productivity, and attrition, if any?
I would say their ability to manage their life does affect their likeliness of persisting, yes. So that does mean that you either have to hire people who have a higher aptitude for that, or you have to give them that aptitude.
Good answer. 44% answered, got some problems here, not sure exactly how to move forward. You said, I believe, let's get this fixed. Maybe that's a great opportunity for you to give us a quick overview of what Tenacity does in terms of approaching this.
Yeah, and I'll be super brief because the point of this is definitely not sales related. But basically, we have a technology that you make available to agents. It reduces attrition in call centers between a fifth and a third, right? So in every center we've been in so far anyway, always between a fifth and a third. So obviously for a real high call center, 10% a month situation, you're talking about really dramatic results. If you're at 3 or 4%, you're still talking about good results. And it's something that basically does three things for agents. It helps them become more resilient to stress, build bond with their coworkers, and get more meaning out of their work. Commercialized out of MIT. We call it retention as a service because it's very much out of the box. And it works on its own. It's not dependent on a bunch of local deployment stuff. We're very proud of that, but whether or not you buy Tenacity someday, we want you to invest in your agents either way. We think the world will be a better place if you do it, and we think your bottom line will be better.
Do you consult as well? Can you help them get started, a fresh look at this?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, even our regular sales process, we do some free consulting, and we do some consulting as well on the side to help companies sort of ask the hard questions about how big is the problem and what might we be able to do to solve it, how can we measure for solving it, and how do we build that case with our executives.
Great, great. Well, Ron also is going to be leading a discussion with our senior leaders. CCNG puts on an annual executive summit, and Ron will be a part of that this year, so thank you for that. If, again, anyone in the audience would like to know more about how you get invited to our executive summit, we're happy to send you that information for you to evaluate. I mentioned that we will have an online discussion group. I actually have it all set up. Many of our members kind of are familiar with pre-event or pre-program online discussion groups, so they jumped in early. Most of you, and maybe the purpose is more post-webinar. So we'll invite you, if you're on this webinar or registered for it, to participate. You'll get an email saying, hey, jump into the online discussion. Questions that have come up since we wrapped this up can certainly be asked and answered. The nice thing about an online discussion group is it's not just hitting Ron, although we welcome you to do that with questions, but other people can chime in on posts and questions and perspectives as well. Ron mentioned that we'll be sharing these slides. We'll obviously be sharing the survey report, the CFO Guide to Attrition, as he mentioned, as it's also linked here, I think, and 24 of you have downloaded it already. But there'll be more information that is shared in that group. So we'll keep the group alive as long as the energy flows among the group players. And I also want to point out that, yes, there's a certain protocol and decorum. As Ron mentioned, it's not a place for selling, it's a place for sharing. But everyone's perspective is welcome, and you'll be able to see who is in the group. I think that's kind of a novelty. Most of us have been on webinars in the past, and the good news is it was good content, and we enjoyed the Q&A. We did about 50% of our time here with Ron and your questions. But we never get to know who the hell else was in the group, right? And I think that can be very important. So CCNG is attacking that in this manner, and I think as things grow over time into the second half of this year, we'll expand the capabilities of online discussion groups and move them into online forums. So appreciate your participation and your feedback on that. So as we wrap things up, again, I want to remind you and encourage you to share this webcast. The link will be available to you shortly via email. You can also follow Ron and his team on Twitter at GoTeamTenacity. You can get to their website at gotenacity.com. And of course, you can always follow us and we'll point you in the right direction. So again, we'll wrap it up from there. Ron, a wealth of knowledge. Thank you for taking an hour of your time to share this. And I hope we get to do a survey down the road so we can start doing year-to-year comparison.
Yeah, thank you all. I really appreciate how much you've taught me in this process. This has been very, very good.
All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye now.